In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build a jig, a sled for the Rikon 3061 to use as a log mill to take logs, branches from your yard and turn them into squared up usable lumber. This jig is fully adjustable and can be made to any size you want. If you want to change this for a large saw, go right ahead. This will just walk you through the steps and you can play with the dimensions yourself. All of this is easily available, cheap material. So what do we need to make this project? Well, here's what I'm going to use. We need something for the base. Now this is going to depend on the size that you want to build your sled, we'll call it that. My sled is going to be about 18 inches long, 8.5 wide, and then, a little wiggle room either way. It's not an exact measurement that I need, but that's roughly what I'm going for. So something wider, longer than that, so we can cut it down to exactly what we want. Ideally, this would be 3/4 of an inch thick, but this is only 5/8, and it's all I have. It's from a dresser I found on the side of the road, so that's what I'm going with. MDF, plywood, something relatively flat, though it's not the biggest deal for this project. We're going to need some kind of hardwood to make the miter slot runner out of. This just happens to be maple, a 2x4, a scrap of 2x4, or some other wood that is at least an inch thick or more. And then some kind of plywood or MDF that we will use for the fence. These are just some multi pieces of poplar glued together that was somebody's dresser face, again, that I found on the side of the road. And I'm going to be using 2 pieces for the fence. These will need to be the length and width of your fence. Now my fence is going to be slightly shorter than my sled, so 15 by 6.5-ish for me. Our sled is going in the miter slot and is on the outside of the Rikon bandsaw, so it can be slightly taller than the throat width of the bandsaw itself, which is 5 inches. So we're able to use 6.5-inch tall for the fence because we're on the outside. And then some scrap wood, and then we'll get into the hardware here. Now this is a bit of a mismatch of what I had in my shop. So I've got numerous, I believe I've got 6 here, 1/4-20, 1/4-inch T-bolts that are 3.5 inches long. That size, it can be a little shorter. A 1/4-20 bolt that is 4 inches long. This one, you'll want this one to be long when we get to it. 4 inches, I think, is a good place to be. And then a bunch of nuts for these bolts. Either buy your own T-bolt handle knobs, or you can make your own. And then some screws, and that will be the materials that we will be using. Tool-wise, I'm going to be using a drill. I'm going to use a drill press. You can do it without. I'm going to need a chisel, obviously the bandsaw, a table saw, though you could do it with some kind of track saw to cut the material to dimensions. And then I'm going to be using super glue for a lot of this, but you could use epoxy if you want. I don't have any epoxy, and honestly, I don't like to make things super permanent always in case I want to change something or borrow a piece later. So in my case, just using super glue here. If you want to glue some of the wood pieces together like the fence, wood glue would be needed as well. We also are going to want to have the router. The router is going to be big for this, ideally with a plunge base. That's how we're going to make our slots for the T-bolts. So you're going to need a router or a jigsaw, which will then require some chiseling. You'll see later how I make the T-slot, T-track, but it's gonna be a lot easier with a router. Trust me on that one. Okay, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut this down to the final size. I'm gonna do 18 by 8.5, and that will be the base of our mill. Now, the reason it's 8.5 is because off to the right of the Rikon, you've only got about 7 inches. But I think there's a little bit of hangover we can play with there for getting slightly thicker logs in there. But you can't go too much over, or else you may have some weight going the wrong way if you don't have the log heavy enough on one side. So that's kind of up to you. I decided on 8.5 based on what I think will balance pretty well. The length is kind of a preference of how long you think your pieces of log will be. Now, I find it a little tricky when there's too much weight one side and I'm feeding it through the bandsaw. So I didn't want to go too long. The key, though, is that I want to be able to use my planer in the end. So I need to be able to fit at least a 12-inch long piece of wood. Minimum planer length is like 10 inches. Some people get away with less. but I wanted to be able to get a minimum of 12. Okay, now that I've got my baseboard to the 18 by 8.5, I want to talk about the basic premise of how this will work. We're going to have a fence that will be connected on an L, probably just through a rabbet joint and then screwed through the front. And there will be two T-track, I'll show you exactly what I mean by that, going through here. We will then slice off some of this, and then T-bolts will slide through so that this can slide back and forth. It will be much shorter, of course. Slide back and forth along those two. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to route out the two slots. Now, where exactly you do this will depend on the length of your fence. I would not put them too far in the middle. I'm going to put mine probably 1.5 inches from the end of this, and I want this with roughly even split on either side, so there'll be 1.5 inches there, as I want some entry wiggle room and some exit wiggle room when I go out. Okay, so I'm going to give a basic idea before we go to do this of what this quote-unquote T-track is going to be like. It's basically taken from the Craig fence system, in that there's a through hole drilled straight through here, and on the bottom there is a groove that this will lock into. You don't see it quite on this one, but I'll show you on what I've done with mine. But it uses essentially a pinching system instead of using exactly actual T-track. So the nuts and bolts will slide through the bottom, the bolts. Now what this looks like on my bench here that I use this for all the time is we've got a 1/4 inch straight bit, spiral bit going all the way through the length that I want. And then underneath we take that same bit and we cut out just the depth of a T-bolt so that when it slides up in there, it locks. It cannot turn. Now, if you want, you can put a strip of wood on the bottom of this to hold that in there. I don't do that, but this is the basic premise of what we're doing. We're going to be putting a 1/4 inch hole, or whatever thickness your bolt is, in a line that we want it to be able to move. And then we'll be routing out a little on the side so that when this bolt turns, it locks. Okay, so the basic layout is going to be about here and about here. Whatever distance this is roughly, probably just a little over 4 inches in. I'm going to be putting identical slots through here, and like I said, our fence will connect and slide on those. I don't want them too far apart, but I don't want them too close together either. And we don't need to go a whole heck of a way here, because we're going to have a back on this fence that is probably going to be about 2 inches. And in the middle of that 2 inches, so exactly 1 inch, will be where our bolt can slide through. That's the farthest back we need to go. So we're going to come in about 1 inch and a little more, and we're going to make our starting mark. Let's call it 1.25 inches. We'll go there, 1.25 inches here. And then because we're going to have a log on this, it doesn't need to go that far either, because we don't need to go all the way. So let's just say the log minimum you want is 3 inches, right? So we only need this fence to slide such that your log can come off the side as much as you want, so 3 inches. So you only would need to get this fence to about there to have a side sticking off that you can essentially saw off to. So therefore, we would only need this slot to go to like here. Now, if you want, you can give yourself as much room as you want and you can go forward more. I would not cut too long of a hole in there, or else you will only be held together by the end. So I'm going to go, let's just call it 5.5 inches. I'm going to go to 5.5 inches. Therefore, my fence will go out to there. Heck, what if I'm cutting, I don't know, something tiny. We'll go 5.5 inches, 1.25 inches in. That leaves enough meat on either end for this to be okay. Now, if you are using a straight bit, you will need to drill pilot holes on either end of this. I'm going to use a spiral bit, so I will just be plunging straight through. I'm going to use the edge guide on either edge to do this, and we're going to go through the bottom, because after we get done doing the through hole, we'll just right from that same side do the side so that our T-bolt cannot move. Okay, we're going to clamp down our board so that the area we are routing through is off the bench or whatever, and make sure these are far enough back so that if you're using an edge guide, you do not run into them. since we're doing identical distances from either side, or at least I am, we won't have to change this setting once we do it once. And we were going to do both of the plunges first before we do the extra little indent area for the T-bolt head. I'm not going to take this in one shot. I'm going to make multiple passes and just work my way down so I don't overheat the router bit at all. If you want to go in one shot, have at it. I'm not going to do that. And remember, if you're using a straight bit, you're going to need to drill pilot holes so that your bit can go down and in. After you've done your first pass, just make sure your T-bolt fits through there. Ideally, you want it relatively snug, but not too snug. We want to be able to move this freely. 1/4-inch bolt, 1/4-inch bit should line up perfectly. All right, go ahead and we'll flip it over and we'll do the other side now. Okay, we've got our initial holes drilled, and now it's time to do our area for the bolt to lock into. Now, this is pretty important to get this right. If you do it too far, you will not be able to lock these bolts. So we're going to make just a rough mark on either end, holding it straight, of where this is. And we know we're going to be pretty much inside of that. Now, one key too is to also go all the way to the end so that if you want to bring your fence all the way back, you can reach the back of this. Do it on the other side as well. And we will, a pass at a time, go through and take off a little bit at a time until we get all the way across. We'll just do these one at a time. It doesn't really matter. We don't need to flip at each pass until we get a perfect fit with just enough room to slide. And we're going to test it as we get close. You do not want to overshoot this. One easy way to get the depth for this right, and this is pretty crucial too, is we want it to be deep enough on the first pass and not have to waste time going back. If you have the Bosch 1617, loosen this up, press it down so you're making contact with your surface, lift this up and just place the head of the bolt inside of there, lock this down, and you've now got the deepness of your bolt. Now, one thing to note is that there is a micro adjust on this. So we're actually going to make it a little looser so that the bolt is definitely sitting underneath the surface and won't scratch our table at all. Okay, we're going to use our adjustment here for our main one to find our line on the outside of our bolt. And we're just going to line this up roughly. As long as we're starting on one side, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just get right on just barely crossing that line just a little bit, because we don't want the perfect width. We need them to be able to move. So just take a little more off, and we can always come back if we need to do that. Remember, also, we're going to come all the way back, and we're going to be starting this cut and finishing this cut all the way to where the maximum end of our bolt is. All right, we're just going to move over until we just hit the edge of this line, and then we're going to stop, and we're going to check the fit. Okay, we are really close, but this is a little too tight. This bolt doesn't move as freely as I wanted. So I'm just gonna go maybe a 64th, just a hair over that way. Okay, this is the fit we're looking for. Easy slide, but when we turn it, we don't have to turn much to lock it. And then we'll just go ahead and do the other side. I'm gonna do that off camera. So when we're all done, it will look like this. Our bolt will be able to slide pretty freely, but there won't be a ton of turning so that when we put the knob on, it will pull up on this and lock it into place. Now that we've got the two T-track slots in our base, we're going to do the beginning of the fence assembly. The first thing we're going to do is we need to attach this in an L, which we will then cut some of this off, and our T-bolts will be sliding through two holes inside of this. Now, to attach this to here, I'm going to do kind of a rabbit joint where I'm going to remove probably 7/16 of an inch and then the height of this and just slide it in there. And then I'm going to just screw in from the front. So the first thing we need to do is remove the section in this area, right? Now, you're obviously going to get roughly the exact height you're going to be taking out of this, ideally. And then the distance in, we want to leave a little bit of meat here for our screw to go in. So this is a little over 3/4 because it's got some veneer on it, which is why I'm going to go just under a 1/2 inch 7/16 or so to give me some meat here so that if I overdrive a screw accidentally, it doesn't split it. Now, you can do this with either a router or a table saw. Now, I'm going to assume most people are going to either not have a router table, which is what I would normally do this on to get a perfectly flat bottom. So we're going to do it on a table saw. You can use, ideally, a flat top grind blade, a rip blade with totally flat teeth, or a second choice combo blade, or third choice, whatever you have. The more flat teeth you have on there, the less cleanup you're going to have to do, as the teeth will leave those traditional kind of V marks, those pointed teeth marks. So I'm going to put my combo blade in and just remove this. And the further we get towards this side, we're going to sneak up on it. We want the height to be pretty darn close. The depth we're going to automatically know from our table saw height, the blade height, so we don't have to worry about sneaking up there. But this height of this board sliding in there, it's really fairly important that they're pretty tight, so when we screw these together we don't have any kind of movement or anything like that. Bring with you both pieces of whatever you're using. Ideally something 3/4. Some stability, some structure is going to help this. The first thing we're actually going to do is we're going to get these to length and width. Now these are already the right width for me. I'm just sticking with what they were. I'm cross-cutting these down to 15, a little over 15, maybe 15 and a half, doesn't really matter. My sled is 18, so it's all going to depend on the size of your sled, but I'd leave a little room on either end so that when you're entering and exiting the cut, your log isn't all the way at the end. You have somewhere to kind of hold and a little weight behind it. So I'm going to cross-cut these to length, and then we'll go through and do the groove. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my blade height to 7/16 of an inch. I'm just going to make a rough mark. And remember, since we're going to be sneaking up on these, we don't need to know exactly where it is. But I know I do not want to overshoot that mark. Now, I'm going to be coming from the bottom in, like so. I'm going to start with the outside. I always prefer, if I'm cutting a rabbit, to do it on the outside. If I'm only doing one piece and I'm not running a ton of stuff, different video, different story, and then working my way in like that. It just means I can keep my hand further away from the blade and whatnot. So if you have a combo tooth blade, if you take this in smaller bites, you're going to get a flatter bottom. If you take this a full blade at a time, you're going to get more of the little fang parts and more chiseling. So just take your time and just do maybe a half blade at a time. This is going to go real quick, and you'll have to do less chiseling if you even want to do any cleanup. If you are doing glue, you are obviously going to need a flat surface to get some glue reference, glue surface on there. And again, I'd suggest the router for that, but we're going to do this with a table saw blade. And once we get even a 1/16 of an inch away, we're going to start checking each time to make sure we get right on the money if possible. Overshoot, well, look, we can put a little shim in there or something if we have to. It's not the end of the world, but really try to get this right on the first go. All right, this is the fit we're looking for. When this is perfectly up, you just want to be able to slide that in and not have it move up and down at all inside of that area. It's hard to show without putting my hand in front of the camera, but that's the fit we want, that it goes in there, but there's really no way it can move up and down, so that when we screw this, this will lock in at a nice 90-degree angle. If you overshoot a little bit, when we go to screw it in, take maybe some shims of printer paper and just put them in there. And when you go to shim it in, and that will probably help if you overshot a little bit. But we are now going to go over and we're going to cut out the slots in the middle of this with the router. Now that we've got the rabbet done, we are going to go into the slots and the system we're going to use to hold the log in place. Now we're going to start out by cutting the back, I'll call it pincher. And the way this is going to work, I've mocked this up, is that this slat essentially will be cut numerous times into here, all roughly the same size. And we're going to use essentially a mortise and tenon through tenon kind of system, wedged through tenon, I guess you'd call it, to slide into our fence. And this will be the back side, or what I'm calling the back, as in the log will be butted up against this and we'll be pushing through that way. And I've got 2 holes drilled in here, and I'm going to use a wedge system to just pinch that in there so that can't go anywhere, and so that it's easily removable, adjustable, and I can store these easily, most importantly. I didn't want something that was too hard to get apart, because when I'm done with it, I'm going to store it. I don't cut a ton of logs. So we're going with a basic wedge system. So the first thing, though, we are going to make is this back brace, because that will be our template for test fitting each of these as we go along. And then the front piece will be a little different, but the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut our very first slot. And that will be what determines the rest of our slots, because after the first slot, we're going to make the tenon to fit that. Just like a mortise and tenon, you cut the mortise first and then we can finesse the tenon. We will cut the tenon to match that, and then that will be used as we slot out the rest of these. So let's lay this out now in detail as to what I'm going to use. Now there is sizing dependency on what you're going to build. So I've decided to lay my slots out based on this being 15.5 inches. I want to keep some meat on the bone between and on the top and bottom. So I've got the rabbet down here, and I've started the bottom of my slots. The fence will look like this, about 3/4 of an inch up from the rabbet. That should give a good portion, good chunk of stability there. Now, the length of these will be partially determined, well, it will be entirely-ish determined by the length of your tenon, essentially. I'm going to just call it a tenon. But the thickness and the length will be decided by how you make this. On the back end, the end sliding in, I've left about 1 inch. These then are going to be roughly 11 16ths for my tenon. But then I left 1 3/4 between the first 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. And then I started to put them a little closer together, about 1 1/4 inches apart for the last, well, 2 here, 1 1/4 inch, and then about 1/2 inch there. And what we're going to essentially have is a similar system to this, a wedged on that side. That this is just for a demo. There's going to be a similar system run through this with a knob and whatnot that will allow us to use our bolt to pinch between the two, so that when we place the log in there, we get it pretty close, and then we can micro adjust this bolt, which will have something on the end to help pinch. You'll see that later, to get the pressure right. And that will allow us to easily undo it and do it and get the log out of there. And then both of these will slide out of the tenons, or of the mortises, for storage. Okay, so we're just going to go through right now, and we're just going to route out, or if you want to use a jigsaw, or you want to mortise and tenon by hand, you want to drill a bunch of holes and clean it up with a chisel, however you want to do it. And we're just going to do this first slot. Like I said, mine is a little under, well, we'll just call it right on 11 16ths, a hair under. And I'm just going to go line to line. And really, this is just setting your standard for what everything else is. You can make this whatever you want, as long as we just make the rest of them the same. So don't feel that you are stuck to 11 16ths. If you want to go smaller, heck, if you want to go bigger, go for it. And you can stick more of these or less of these in there. But this first one is setting our standard for what our holder and our pincher are going to be, and the rest of them. I'm just using a square to go across. And when I'm routing, I've always preferred placing the rounded side up against my straight edge. I don't like trying to keep the flat side up against there. And the nice thing about a router, unlike a table saw, is it has a center point of cut. The cut is always going to be directly in the center. So if you have a base that is circular on 3/4 of it, no matter which area of that, it's always going to have the cutter in the same spot. And that allows you to, if you accidentally move a little bit, that center point of cutting is never going to move off the line. If you place the straight part up against there and you deviate it all, it's going to move off of your line. So I highly suggest that if you are not comfortable putting the straight edge up against and your router has a rounded area, just go with the rounded area on your straight edge. Now that we've got our first slot cut, routed, however you did it, this is going to be our reference, and we're going to make our back brace tenon. Now this will be similar to the process we will do later. We're going to use a slightly different shape here. But really, I've decided to change this and just make this a single shoulder for simplicity's sake, so we don't have to worry about measuring. from two different sides. So imagine this is just a single shoulder. We're going to take our 2x4 here, or whatever your thicker piece of wood is. You really just need something that has a little bit of a shoulder ability, maybe a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch sticking out the back. This is probably a little thicker than it needs to be, but irrelevant. And we are going to then measure the distance into this hole. So I'm just going to do this by eye. I'm just going to hold it up. I'm going to touch the edge of this into the outer edge here, hold it there, and make a mark. All right, now that is going to be what I leave remaining. So we're going to cut this section off, and we're going to do this on the table saw with the miter gauge. Now we also need to know the length, our total length that is going to go here. We're not going to cut the total length until after. It's much easier to do this with a larger workpiece. But we need to know the total length so that we know how long to cut the tenon. Now I'm going to have 2.5 inches in front. This will be partially dependent upon the scale of your entire jig and the size of logs you plan to use. I think that's enough to probably pinch most logs I'm going to use in here. I don't think I need it to be any bigger, and I don't want to add more weight than I have to. So 2.5. This board is a little under an inch. It's a funky length with the veneers on either side. And then I'm going to have an inch sticking out the back. So I'm just going to call that 4.5 inches total, because for our wedges, we're going to drill 2 1/2-inch holes. So you want a little bit of meat, which is why I'm going to go with an inch on the back here. So 4.5 total, meaning that we will be subtracting the 2.5. We're going to leave the 2.5, and in my case, I'm going to be cutting out 2 inches of the tenon. So I'll just go ahead and mark that. There's my 2 inches. We know we're cutting out this section. I'm just going to lay out all the lines here, and we'll go to the table saw and cut this. Bring this with you. We're going to try to get it on one shot, but if not, we'd rather start a little lower and have to raise the table saw just a little bit. We don't want this having to be super tight, but we don't want it wobbling everywhere, but we do want to get it in and out. So I'll show you the fit after I get it cut that we're looking for. Okay, so at the table saw, you're going to need either your miter gauge or your crosscut sled. And of course, you can do all of this by hand if you want to, and just saw it like a normal tenon. I just prefer to do it on the machines, but don't let that stop you. Absolutely, you can do it by hand. So we're just going to set the saw blade height just so the top of the tooth, the tallest side of the tooth, is just hitting our line. And we want to make sure that we get to that line and take it all away so that we don't have to do a ton of chiseling afterwards to get it to the fit. Okay, once you've got your height set, we're going to make the cut at the very shoulder of the tenon first. We're going to cut that so it's nice and clean, and then we'll just go back over and work our way across. But I like to get that shoulder cut on the first cut through. There's support on both sides. It just makes it cleaner, and you also have a flat spot right at. Okay, now that we've got our tenon cut, our fit should look relatively easy to get in there. Just a little bit of wiggle room, that's fine, because we want to be able to get it out. We want to make sure it goes in. This is your template for the rest of the slots being drilled. You will notice that these are already drilled and this is out of order, and it's because I lost the other piece to this. I have no idea where it is, so I had to remake it. So we're going back and we're filming an earlier piece. How fun. Okay, anyways, now we are going to drill 2 holes into this to use with our wedge system. So put this in here, place it hard up against, and just make a mark on either side of where you want, either side, whichever side you want. And the key to this is we're going to be drilling a 1/2-inch hole. In my case, you can use something smaller, something larger maybe, but you'll have to change the size of this a little bit. Anyways, a 1/2-inch hole with the center directly on this line. I'm going to drill 2 of them. And what that will do is it will allow me to make a wedge where we are a 1/2-inch diameter up here, so it can be rounded to slide in, but the direct middle will be where these 2 meet. meaning that the back of our wedge can then be flat and it will sit right up against this nice and snug. It's pretty important to get this hole drilled right, but as long as it's closer to flat than not closer to flat, you've got it right. So I suggest just drilling the hole essentially straight in the middle. If worst case scenario, drill it a little further in so that you definitely have a flat bottom for your wedge. And this will make more sense once we do the wedges and you see what I mean. But having it so that the exact middle of the hole is on this line or even slightly in is preferable. We want this flat. If we have it any further out, you could see that this wouldn't be totally flat. We'd have a coming down of a circle here, which would be problematic. Okay, we're now gonna drill the hole. If you are slightly unsure about this, just put the hole slightly behind the line. That's the safest thing to do. If you're not sure, you can get it directly in the middle. It's better to be behind the line than in front of the line. I just want to note for hole placement, doesn't really matter as long as you leave a little meat up here, a little meat down here, and a little meat in the middle. So just space them out a little bit because we're going to be putting wedges in. We want to have room for our wedges. We don't want to weaken the structure of this at all, but there's no like required spacing on these. Just go with, you know, what you feel gives enough strength on either end and in the middle. And I'd also like to say that lining these up perfectly with each other is not essential. We're going to make wedges for each of them, and if they're not perfectly lined up, we can always just mark the wedges with the number and match it to the hole and not have to worry about that. Okay, now that we've got our first one routed, we've got our back brace, we know it fits. This is our template. This is what we're going to use to test each of them. These don't have to be perfect. They just need to be pretty close. A little on the looser side is okay to make this easier to get in and out. It's better than having to pound this, but you don't want this thing flopping. But a little loose is okay because the wedges will pull it tight. It's not the biggest deal. Okay, I want to get into the next part here. The first is going to be, and some of these are personal choices based on what you think you're going to be sawing, the length of this tenon back brace that sticks out. Now, if you're going to be using very short pen blanks or very thin logs, there's another thing you can do here. You can actually remove some of this width so that this can move down farther. You could cut out a little L here, and this could then slide all the way towards the bottom if that's something you want to do. Most of my logs are going to be 6, 7, 5, 8 inches in diameter. So I'm just having this at a stable locked in height here. Now that we've got that over with, let's talk about the wedge. I've done sort of a mock-up of the first one here, and this is just my concept that I'm going to go with. You are free to go with whatever concept you want to do. And of course, you could have mortise and tenoned these holes. You could have not drilled them. You could have done it by hand, and it could be a square, and this could be much quicker. Whatever you want to do, that's you. But for what we're going to do here, we see based on where we drilled that we have essentially a half circle sticking up. So we need a piece of wood cut that the leading edge is essentially a half circle that's going to slot through that. It's going to be flat on the back so that it lays flat on here. And it's going to have, in my opinion, I wanted some thickness so that I could easily grab it and pull it out. Because this is only going to be, if you drilled directly in the center, about 1/4 inch high and 1/2 inch wide. There wouldn't be much to grab if you made this whole thing 1/4 inch. So I cut this at about 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch and then took a chisel and then chiseled my way, test fitting until it slides in there, goes through, and that thing's not going anywhere. Now I'm not going to leave it this long. I'm going to cut it off probably here, and I'm actually going to drill another hole and stick a little dowel in there so that I can just pull it out real easily. So if you want to do it my way, I'll show you a little bit of how I do it and how I'm doing it. And really this is just finesse with a chisel and getting it to fit. But I would cut numerous 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch pieces because if you overshoot, you're going to have to do another one. Okay, this is a closer look at the wedge that I've got going on here. It's pretty rough, again, done with a chisel. If you're somebody who carves, you can probably make this look really nice. but I've essentially just have the length here at about 1/4 inch that gets me through to the end of this. And then it tapers up here. Again, it's pretty ugly. Ignore that so that it stops. And then I've also had to, of course, because it's a circle or a half circle, round the edges, narrower on the front so it can slide in, and then it gets a little bit wider until we get to the full 1/2 inch here. And that allows for a really good fit. As at the end of the day, it's going to be getting just pressed on by the log that we force forward. So we need to lock it in there pretty well. Okay, so I'm just gonna show you a few bits of how I'm gonna make these wedges. And I think on the front part, maybe we'll do it square and we'll just show the wedges that way too. I'm gonna just come to the top of this and just mark that out right where that's gonna intersect. And that's gonna be the line I'm gonna get below just a little bit on the front leading edge. And then I also know I wanna get about that far through. So I'm going to start my taper kind of in this area. We'll cross this line here. So we're going to need to go, based on how the other one worked out, kind of back down like this. And again, this is going to be a test fitting thing, and then I'm going to come up in that area. And I'll have to work a little lower than this almost certainly. And then we know it's a circle, so we're going to be kind of doing something was hard to draw, but something kind of like that. In the end, it will look more like that with the wedge coming down. And again, just remember to leave the back flat so that it sits up there nicely. You can see I put the dowel in on this side here to give myself something to grab onto. You don't have to do that. Just keep this near you and test fit it as you get close. And then as we get to the later parts, I flip the chisel around to do a little bit more scooping. But it helps to draw these lines. And this is where I'm coming in and I'm just scooping a little bit. All right, and that's bingo right there. Not going anywhere. Got a nice fit, got a nice part sticking out. I think in the end, this length turned out to be 2 3/4. I'm gonna cut this one the same, put a dowel in there, and we will then go on to making our front pincher. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a similar, well, nearly identical version of this, but of a different size. And here's why it's going to be a different size. The pincer screwing mechanism will be in the middle of this. Now, logs of different sizes may need that center to slide up and down a little bit. So we're going to make this a little bit smaller, well, about half the size, so it can move to put the pressure force in the middle of the log. So this is going to be, for me, 1 3/4 is what I'm going to go with. And I'm going to do the same thing I did on this side here. I'm going to cut off so that there's only a single shoulder, which I'm going to make just the thickness of this very front one. I don't need it any larger because if it's at the full capacity, I don't need it to hang over. It's not going to do anything extra. So I'm removing about 1/2 inch. This is going to be about 11/16. We're going to do the same process of just removing with either a dado stack, or again, if you want to do any of this by hand, have at it. And I'm going to use a single table saw blade. Now, it also would help to have a scrap of pine that we can use another piece of this 2x4 after we're done, but it's easier to make the handles out of something that's a little thinner already. But if we want, we can cut this down as well. All right, so let's head over to the table saw and get this tenon to fit right. That's our starting spot. And don't cut the tenon to length yet. We'll do that at the very end. It's easier to work with for other things when it's a larger size. All right, I've got my fit here that I'm happy with for now. And we can slide up and down, which will allow us to move the center of the pincher where we want. Now, before we do anything, we're gonna do a wedge as well, just to get this locked in. I believe I said I'd do a normal square wedge this time, so I'm gonna mark it out, and I'm just gonna do a single one, and essentially just, I'm gonna drill out most of it and then chisel out the remaining corners to get it square. Okay, this is what I am going to make my wedge size. That's about 7/8 of an inch. I'm going from the inside of this line, and about a 1/2 inch. So 7/8 by a 1/2 is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take it to the drill press. I can do this with a hand drill and just drill out the middle of this, and then we'll just chisel down the sides. So this is roughly what it looks like after the drilling. I just used a 1/4 inch Forstner to remove as much as I could. Now, ahead of time, I should have mentioned this, and hopefully you'll be watching this through first. Take a marking knife, marking gauge, and score the edges of the line so you have something for your chisel to sit into. And if you're looking for really good hand tool stuff, people like Rob Cosman, Rex Kruger, Paul Sellers, those are your people. I'm not your person for that. I am pretty rudimentary when it comes to hand tools. So don't look to me for exactly the right way you should be doing it. Okay, I'm going to call that good, and now I'm going to do the fit for the tenon, for the wedge, sorry. Okay, so it's pretty rough, ignore that, but I've made sure, just like with drilling the holes, we have marked a line, and we have cut our oh my god, what am I calling this, mortise, through that line a little bit, so that when we go to make the wedge and place it in, our wedge will be the thing making contact with the fence, and it won't be sitting on this wood because we want to pull it tight. So I'm just going to go cut a piece of wood, rectangle, that fits through there, and if I need to pare it down at all to make it fit perfectly, I will do so. And this will just take you a little trial and error, but it'll probably actually be easier than the 2-hole drilled one. Okay, there's my wedge for the backside. Basically, I just cut a piece of wood that was about the height, just a little over. And then I just took the block plane and just feathered it down a little bit so that the entrance was easier. And then I feathered down one side so that the entrance is easier there. And it slides right in. I'm going to cut mine off before it overlaps this hole. I'm going to put another dowel in there to help pull it out. That's all you need to do. This thing isn't going anywhere. Okay, to make the pincer mechanism, take this, your front brace, and then you're going to find, however long this is, the center of this minus 2 inches out. So 1 inch. I'm going to go 1 inch out from the edge there, and then directly in the middle if possible. And we are going to drill a hole straight through. Now, if you are using the nuts for this, you're going to drill a hole that's just slightly undersized than this. Don't drill one bigger. And then you're going to take a chisel, and you're going to chisel out a pentagon. And then it will sit in there. You just mallet it in there, put a little super glue. Do the same on both sides. This is really important that this hole is straight up and down so that when we then feed the bolt through, it will be held in between 2 nuts. And as we screw it in and out, the pressure will be able to be held by the 2 nuts. And that will allow us to then twist this through, place pressure on the log, and hold it directly in the middle. I hope that made sense. We'll walk through it. First thing you're going to do is you're going to find the middle of this this way. Find the middle of your back brace. Put that there and drill a hole through. Now, the reason I said go ahead and drill the hole all the way through, the size for these nuts, is that in case you don't drill at 90 degrees, if your bolt were to be a 1/4-20 and you were to drill a 1/4 inch hole and not be able to line these up right, there'd be no wiggle room. But because we're going to have nuts on either side that will keep this bolt straight, so even though the hole through the middle is wider than the bolt, that provides us a little wiggle room, especially if you're doing this by hand. So you're going to now take the nut, and I believe these are actually hexagons. Just lay that on there and just mark out roughly where you need to go, and take this little bit by little bit with the chisel until you can get it seated in there with a good mallet whack. If you get it sort of stuck and need to pull it out, let's say it's in there, it's a little stuck, you're not quite there, screw a bolt in there and then yank it out. I like to start by just pressing all 6 sides in there. I think these are 6-sided hexagon that you've gone. I went with a 3/8 to fit these nuts, which are about 7/16 from end to end. So I went with 3/8, and then I'm going to chisel out the remaining amount. All right, I've got the right dimensions. I just need to go deeper now. So go deeper until they are slightly below the surface or flush, and then do it on both sides. And then check it with the bolt, screw it all the way through, make sure everything works perfectly, and then go ahead and super glue each of them in there. Okay, after you've got your nuts in there and cut this to length, you should be able to just turn this, and we will put a handle on this or a knob on this to help us. I mean, you don't have to if you don't want to. In and out, and it should help you once you are in here, apply pressure. But I really like the idea of how clamps have this pivoting head here. And the reason I like that is because when we cut logs, ideally they're going to be flat on the back, but oftentimes you're cutting it with a chainsaw or a bandsaw, and it's not a nice, clean, perfect cut. You're going to have a log up against the fence. It may, on the initial cut, may force it at a weird angle. So I think the ideal world here is to create a mechanism with a floating tip that will allow any slight changes in angle to still be pushed in. Here I've grabbed a couple of these bolts, is to take a Dremel and start to try to round this head a little bit. And then I'd like to cut out a circle of some hardwood and create an open cavity inside of that the circle can sit in. And then once it's on there, to glue a piece behind it that will essentially be, this piece will be 2 pieces, and it will be permanently affixed inside of there. Okay, I've arrived at my solution to creating the clamp-like head for this to deal with uneven logs. So what I've done here is I've taken one of the 1/4 bolts, and I have entirely, with a Dremel, rounded this thing over and made it nice and smooth so that it will pivot relatively freely, and we're going to put some paste wax in there. I have taken a 1/2-inch drill bit, a normal twist drill bit, which has the kind of rounded, conical, what do I want to call it, spherical bottom, which is important. And then just another piece of pine. And what I've done is, this is a 1/2 inch, and it goes down about a 3/16 of an inch past the head of the bolt, allowing for a lot of wiggle room. Now, to keep that on there, I have put a 3/8 inch hole in this piece, which is pretty critical to have this actually relatively wide. That will slide on there, and it will be glued onto here. It will not be glued to the bolt, but it will be glued onto the other piece of wood so that our head can spin freely while our bolt is being screwed in. I hope that makes sense. And this will give us the clamp-like mechanism we are searching for. So I am going to do this for real with a piece of cherry, something nice and smooth that will wear well, as that's inside of there. It did take me a little while to get this right. I started with sandpaper on, I just mounted my random orbit sander and started going around. It was taking too long. So I just put a 150 grit or 220 grit on the Dremel and just mounted it like this and started going around, and then just made this nice and smooth and relatively rounded. Doesn't need to be a whole lot because we just want it to not get caught up on anything. We want it to be able to spin and move freely inside of there. I'm going to just start making it out of this piece, and then I will cut it out later. Now, dimensionally for this ended up being about a 1/2 inch, and this hole down to the very bottom tip, the end of this bit, is 7/16. So we're going right up against there so we can make this as small as possible while having plenty of pivot room. You could probably go a little shallower. And the reason I'm using this bit is because the twist bits have this kind of bull-nosed shape to them, which will give our bolt head more room to spin. I'm just going to move over here somewhere and just drill the 3/8 all the way straight through. I will then be cutting that off, bandsawing that down to the right thickness, cutting this off, and then bandsawing that down as well. Okay, and that is what we're looking for. And I'm going to go cut these narrower and we'll assemble the head. Okay, I have got the cherry version done. I'm going to take a little paste wax, put it inside of there. I had some internal debates about the size of this, and ultimately I decided to keep it relatively small to not have a large weight to spin back and forth. I don't know if that's the right call. You may want to play with the diameter of this a little bit before you glue it together. I'm sticking small. We'll see how it goes. I can always make more of these in the future if need be. And this should keep this nice and moving freely for all of eternity. And then I'm gonna just do a dot of super glue and then a little dot or two of this, because I'd like this to be pretty permanent, even though you essentially make it hard to get the bolt out if you ever need it again, but I don't want this coming off under pressure. And the reason I'm using both is that this is not easy to clamp. So I'm gonna use the super glue essentially as my clamp, press it down until the super glue dries enough, and then that will hold it overnight while the wood glue dries. Try hard not to let any of the glue hit the bolt as you go down. Okay, the knob that we're gonna use to turn this is pretty basic. We're gonna use just the same method we did on these, embed a nut in there that's 1/4-20 or whatever bolt size. You're gonna need 2 more. And once it's threaded through there, we're just going to put one on either side of it and pinch it in place. And I'm not going to glue or anything, because in case I need to take this out of there for whatever reason, I don't love making things permanent if I don't have to. And then you just get your wrenches, tighten that down, and that will be your knob. Of course, you will feed it through there first. Feed it through there first before you attach it, and that will turn for you. Okay, we will now attach the fence to the base holder. Okay, we are now going to do our fence assembly, and you will notice from the markings on here, I forgot to hit record the first time. So we'll take our base, we're going to identify the back, we're going to pop a bolt, a T-nut, T-bolt, through the groove. We're going to push it all the way to the back. We're going to take what will be our base, which we are eventually going to rip down. We're going to hold it up there. Now I am putting mine 3 inches from the back, so that when I insert my fence, go ahead and screw a knob on, that clears. I want to be able to tighten and loosen these, obviously, from the fence. Be very careful not to drill your holes so that your knobs cannot turn. Okay, so marked out the cut line, and then I know I'm going to just draw my X, as I've already done here, that is where we will be ripping. We are then going to turn this over. I'm going to line up roughly where I would like the fence to be centered. You can set it back, forth. Maybe your fence is longer than this whole thing, however you want to do it. And then just make 2 marks in the dead center of the T-track, and then go back around and transfer the back of where your bolt hits so that you can drill that line. You'll take that where the bolt hits, you make a mark right here, you will take your square and you will transfer it to both of those lines. After you have drilled your hole through, like I said, I'm doing 5/16, these are 1/4 inch. I'm gonna go ahead and rip this, and then we will assemble it onto here. Okay, so to assemble this base, just to show us how it's gonna work, feed our T-bolt through there, feed our T-bolt through the other side. We then will have our back here, which will slide onto our T-bolts. It can move freely, which is exactly what we want. Then we are about to screw this onto here. Then our tightening knobs will go onto here, and that holds that down. You've got one on either side. If you want to trim your bolts down, have at it. I leave mine long to be repurposed for lots of different things. But that locks our fence in. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to drive 4 screws into this. If you want to do more to that, go for it. So let me get this connected. And then after that, we're just going to put on a miter bar. We're going to look at it on our bandsaw where we want it, put on a miter bar. You can run this on your fence if you want. You just lose some ability the size of the log. Okay, well, before I put the miter bar in, we'll just take a look at the finished product here, because it's going to be hard to balance this thing on the table when the miter bar's in. This log is actually what led me to build this whole thing. I had a just unbelievably annoying time getting this cut. I was hot gluing it to other things to run against the fence, etc., etc. So there's our pincer. When we come around to the back, we've got our 2 wedges, we've got our knobs, which can be used to move the fence as far forward as we want. Now, obviously, you're going to decide with the miter bar how far out this will stick, and you obviously don't want to cut these off. but this allows us to take the log pretty much anywhere. And this is going to be offset a bit from the bandsaw blade, so we'll be able to get a pretty hefty log in there. And you just put this where you want. Let's say you wanted it off the edge like that. Bring it back against the fence. Tighten it up. And that's not going anywhere. That log is nicely in there. Put the fence there, bring it down. And there we go. There's our log held in there, not going anywhere. You run it through the bandsaw. Obviously it would be circular. And you will cut off a square, flat, straight edge to give you a one reference surface so you can turn it. Then put the flat part against the bottom of this, cut the next one, etc., etc. There's so much you can play with size-wise. If you're using really small pieces, you're going to need this to go lower, and there is still room for it to go down. I just didn't put it all the way down, but you're going to need this to go much lower. You may not need the same size of fence. If you want to cut big logs, you're going to need to make a beefier, bigger, longer, wider sled here. So a lot of this is going to come down to your dimensions. My dimensions fit essentially exactly a 12-inch log, which is what I wanted so that I could run it through the planer. And based on my dimensions that you heard throughout the video, know that that will lead you to a 12-inch log. Add another inch to the spacing of the fence and the base here for every inch extra you want to cut of log length. So add 3 inches if you want to cut 15, etc. Now that we've got our sled built, let's think about the miter bar in the slot and where we're going to attach it to this. Now, on the Rikon itself, you've got about, 5 1/4 to the interior of the miter bar. Now, I don't want this running directly up against the blade. And part of this is going to give us more depth of cut for a bigger log. The further we set it out here, the more we can cut. However, with the log further back, the more weight we're going to get this way. So this total base for me came out to be 8.5 inches. I'm going to set this about a 1/2 inch away from the blade to just buy myself some room, because these, if I'm further forward, will stick out some, and I'd prefer not to have to cut them off as I'm cutting a log. So for me, if that's about a 1/2 inch, that means we are going to set this about 3 3/4 in. I'm just going to give myself a rough guide here. And then there's the other side. And remember, on the Rikon here, this is a weird miter bar. It's not a full 3/4 by 3/8 or whatever bigger tools are. This is the 5/8 by a quarter, 13 inches. However, I'm going to want my miter bar to stick out ahead of my sled and behind my sled. My sled came out to 18 inches, so I'm going to go probably up to 20. And then I'm going to set a little bit ahead, but more of it coming out the back, so that as I finish the cut, we have a little more locking in here at the back. Now, miter bars are tricky when you're making them out of wood because you have to deal with expansion and contraction. The ideal scenario is to cut your own with a quarter sawn direction running this way. So the rings will be straight up and down as close to possible vertically when we cut it. Now, that will allow an entrance of a pretty good dimension. And then when we're through, we will still be connected here. Now, because this is on the outside, we actually get to hold it through here, giving us a little more leverage, but you can see how it wants to tip. Now, of course, the log will finish here, so we're fine there. But yeah, let's make this miter bar. We'll put it on here. We're going to want it as square as possible, but again, it's not the biggest deal because really what we're just doing is we're squaring up a side of the log. So if we're off by a few thousandths or a little bit, it doesn't matter. We're going to use this as reference plus a 1/2 inch for our line. If you want to make it closer, go ahead. You may have to cut these off a little bit if you want to move this fence as far forward as possible, because this fence can go quite a ways up there. And that's good, but you're going to have to weigh that versus cutting these off and how big these are. And if you have a really big log and you're way back here and it's, you could get a real big log in here, you need some pressure and you'd only be on the back corner. So it's up to you. You got to play with this a little bit and think about your own dimensions. This video is more just a how-to and not build this exact size if you don't want to. Okay, I've got my miter bar fit here. We're looking for a nice smooth glide, but not much, if any, side to side expansion. Just, just loose enough so that if it does expand, which it shouldn't a ton due to our quarter sawn, that we can, put a little wax on there and it'll keep going. Now, we want to get the height cut down, and we want to go just a little bit lower than the height of this bar. We don't actually want this riding directly on the bottom because that can cause other issues with the jig sitting flat on the table. We want the jig sitting flat on the table and this just riding just a little bit. So just make a pencil mark right where that meets, and then just cut off that pencil mark and you'll be right there. Now, to put this on, we're going to need a little either double-sided tape, hot glue. I'm going to drill some holes through the bottom, countersink, and just 3 or 4 screws. One added tip is that when you're cutting this on the table saw, I wouldn't try to get it perfect from the table saw. I'd get it so it's a tight fit, and then I'd take a hand plane and just go across a little bit. You could use sandpaper. It's much better to finesse this instead of overcutting it. If you cut it too loose, you have to just start all over. I also use a test piece to make sure the fit is right. I just grabbed a piece of pine, did the test fit to get close. That way you get the piece of wood you want, you get the right cut, and you're not doing this 2-3 times. Now, what I will say, once you get this right on the table saw, if you plan to ever make any other jigs for this, cut like 3 or 4 of these out at the same time. So you just keep a few of these around, just label them miter bar for bandsaw, and stick them away for any future jigs so you don't have to go through this process over and over again. We're gonna now attach this miter bar. So I'm just gonna take pieces of paper and fold them up. And we want to raise the height so that this is either level or just slightly above. But before we do that, I'm just going to use strips of blue tape. You can do double-sided tape, whatever you wanna do. And we are going to have this so that when we set the jig down, it adheres to the miter bar, so then we can take it off and glue it on there. I put a fair few number of these on there just so it really holds when I pull it out of there. Hot glue also works, and if you want to use double-sided tape, go for it. I just find that stuff to be expensive. All right, you're gonna grab a square, and I'm gonna use 2 clamps. I just like it to be held in when I go to then take it over to the bench and screw it in. But you're going to need a square to help square this to the table. To take your base off of your jig, make sure you remember which side the back is. You're going to pull this out. We're going to, at least in my case, I'm going to just, I think, triple fold these and just stick 2 of them in there. These are just normal computer paper. We're going to make mark of where we want the sled. I want some sticking out the front and the back, a little more out the back than the front. I'm going to bring my square over here. Got the back. I'm going to square this up a little more out the back, about a 1/2 inch away from the blade. And I'm going to just set it down gently. I'm going to sit there and hold this for probably 30 seconds. When you add the first clamp, it's going to get heavy on that side, so be careful. Okay, so we're going to need screws. I'm going to hand turn these in there. A drill bit. We do not want this to split, so make sure the drill bit is the right size. Now, for me, this is only 5/8 and this is 1/4, so it's only 7/8 of an inch thick. So I'm going to end up using 3/4 inch screws so that I don't go through. Though I am just going to drill the hole through, it doesn't matter. And then make sure you have a countersink bit. I'm going to put 4 in here. And make sure you countersink these so that the bottom of our screws are not scraped. And like I said, I hand screw these in because in the past I have split very tiny little miter bars before. Now, one troubleshooting tip is that occasionally when you put screws in, it just bulges out the side just the slightest bit. So if you go and stick it back in there and it's a little sticky, just take some sandpaper and wipe down, sand down the sides right by the screws, and that should solve it. And then stick some wax on there, and there we go. We have the base done in there. It looks like I need to sand a little bit on the front one here. Your sled should be done at this point. You can do whatever other stuff you want to it. I know some people put varnish on jigs. So go ahead and we'll just assemble this now, and we'll go ahead and do some test cuts. All right, now I personally am going to be storing this in pieces to fit it into a smaller area. So let's just go ahead and do the assembly here. And there we have it. We can now put our piece of wood inside of that and move our fence forward. And position, you can cut at angles if you want. You can just go back and forth, straight up and down, or straight 90 degrees. All right, so if I want to cut a straight line on this, I'm just going to kind of eyeball this up there. Make sure I've got my straight line. If you want to use your square to square this up, you just check that in the back, lock our fence in place, and then tighten down our log. And there we go. We've got our jig ready to run through the bandsaw. All right, we're gonna do the first test now. I would have liked to have used a 3/8 of an inch blade, but the company I like to buy them from was out of stock. I didn't want to wait. I have no idea how long it's gonna be before they're back in. So we're gonna just go ahead and try this with a 1/4 inch, 3 teeth per inch blade. Not ideal. 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch is really what you want here, but timing just didn't work out with the company that I like to buy from. Now remember, we have to support the cut going in and coming out. For my sled dimensions, this has to be all the way up and exposing the 5 inches. Okay, so to rotate it, I realized because this is a lot smaller than this is what this was designed for, that I'm going to need a little booster seat here. I may even make something that can just sit on there if need be, but I don't ever really intend to cut logs this small. Anyways, so we flip it over, get that set on there, and because this is nice and flat, we know that the next side will be roughly 90 degrees. Obviously, it's going to be a rough cut, and you'll have to do some hand planing or squaring up. And we just need this second cut, and then we can put it against our normal bandsaw fence. So we'll tighten that in there. We're not going anywhere. And we will go take it and cut this next side then. I also think we probably don't need it hanging over so much. So while the log is locked in there, we'll see if this works with that little booster seat. And then we will square this up so that we're getting a roughly straight cut. Now, as you can see from the first cut, this creates an unimaginable amount of dust. If you have a split that you can use for your vacuum, using one of these right here would probably help. I only have a single one. I don't have a dual split port in this hose, so I'm still going to go underneath because I don't want it clogging up the inside of the bandsaw. But I'm going to go ahead and pop this out because that'll just let more of the dust get down into the bandsaw to be sucked away. All right, now we can just ride this guy up the fence to square up the next two sides and have ourselves a pretty square piece of wood. And there we have it. There is the log milling machine home build DIY for your Rikon 3061. And we're able to get a nice squared up log here. We can obviously go much larger. And in the last segment, I'm going to go into some modifications I think you could make depending upon what you want to do with this. But the goal is to get you 2 square sides, or roughly square, that you can run up against the fence. And now you can either put this through the planer, you can use a hand plane, whatever you want to do, and you've got a square piece of wood. Okay, I just want to go over some thoughts and possible changes, modifications that you could make. Now, the first obvious one is the size. If you go by the exact dimensions I do, you will get about 12 inches, a little over, inside of here. If you want to get more than that, for the dimensions of this fence and these, if these remain consistent, you will need to add a little over an inch for every inch of log you want to add. So if you want to do a 15-inch log, you're going to need to add 3 inches to this entire thing. Other than that, though, size-wise, you can go a little taller, a little smaller on the fence. Some other modifications are, if you are planning to do very small logs, you may want to have this slot right here, or all of these slots, to be honest, down further so that you can drop down. You notice when we were doing the test log, which was fairly small, I needed to put a little booster seat to raise it up. And it fit, and it worked, and it didn't, bother the ability to cut. But if you want to go down lower, make these slots longer. I already cut this slightly narrower or smaller so that it could go down a little bit more. Some other options are some kind of grippiness back here. Maybe sandpaper glued to this could be helpful, though I didn't find any huge issue holding it. If there is such thing as a, I don't know what they call it, maybe a ball joint, some kind of thing like that on the end of a screw, you may not have to make this at all. I don't know. I didn't want to buy anything for this build, but that may be something you can just buy instead of making that. But I think it's really important to have some flexibility, some movement in this. You can also just make this more permanent with glue in different areas. And one thing I'm really interested in that I may explore is with this back brace here. Let's take it out, put our wedges aside. I think there's a possibility of drilling some 1/2-inch holes in here and having, pretty far to the forward, and having 1/2-inch dowels that can be added in if you don't want to make this lower. That can be added in for things that are smaller. So you would put them in and they would drop down for an even smaller log. I think that could be kind of cool. So some hidden drop down dowels that you can place in there. You know, just little modifications that would allow you then to do big and small, because the smaller you start making things, the harder it is going to be to hold a big log. The bigger, the harder it's going to be to hold a small log. And with the L design here, there's only so far down we can go. Now, if you want to construct it differently, you can go ahead and do that if you think you can get these down lower. I've got maybe another 1/4 inch I could go, 3/8 of an inch, but it'd be getting a little thin. So I didn't really want to go lower, but drop down dowels could be interesting. Another modification could be if you just want to embed real T-track in here, have at it. You can absolutely do that. I didn't want to buy T-track. I like to reuse these bolts for different things, but if I wasn't going to, I would cut these down quite a bit so that it didn't interfere with my wedges at the lowest point. They don't really, but it would just be easier. I'll probably also make these knobs a little bit smaller. I'll probably make one for that as well, a little smaller, so that there's no getting in the way of my wedges. Those are the kind of things that with use, you'll kind of figure out what you want. And a lot of this can be made in sections. You can, remake these different pieces the sizes you want if you decide later that you want to make a change. But overall, I'm actually thrilled with this. If you would like to run this up against the fence, you absolutely can. You're going to have to remove a lot of height here because the Rikon has 5 inches at the throat and then it slopes down. So you're going to lose a lot. I really like the miter slot. You can get even bigger logs, right? Like we can go probably 8 or 9 inches in diameter going all the way back on this. But if you want to make this even wider and keep that slot going back, you could absolutely do it. Now, obviously, with the Rikon 3061, we are limited by the size of the bandsaw table in many ways as well. If you had a bigger bandsaw and you want to make this for that, you can go a lot bigger depending upon your table. And it's really just about the weight and how it balances on the miter slot. The further back you have it, you don't want it to tip over. You want it to be easy to handle. You could certainly make this longer. Like I said, add 1 inch to the fence for every inch of log you want to add. And just overall, this is going to be really custom to you and what you want to do with it. But I had a lot of fun. I'm going to definitely use this summer. So I just want to thank everyone for joining. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you would like me to test something, if you want to see a build for something else, if I can do it, if I can afford it, if it's within my skill set, I'd definitely be interested in doing it someday. I have a lot of fun doing these, and that's why I do them, for fun. So thank you. Have a good one.